My name is Claire. I'm 26 years old, and the day my college acceptance letter arrived, the day I thought my entire life was about to change, my mother grabbed it from my hands, struck a match, and set it on fire in front of the whole family. I watched the flame race across the thick cream paper, curling its edges inward, devouring each word I had waited years to read. My acceptance, my escape, my proof that I could rise above everything they had told me I couldn't do. It was gone in seconds, replaced by the bitter smell of burnt ink and my mother's voice saying, "You'll just fail like always." If you're watching this, I'd love to know where you're viewing from. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to know their future belongs to them, no matter who tries to take it away. The story I'm about to tell isn't just about loss. It's about rebuilding from ashes stronger than before. Millbrook wasn't a place where dreams grew. It was an industrial town built around its factories, the streets looping back into themselves like there was nowhere else to go. The factory whistle was the town's clock, sharp at dawn, again at midday, and once more at dusk, marking the slow, grinding passage of time. Our home sat at the farthest edge of town, a two-bedroom box with paint peeling in strips that clung through winter only to surrender in the summer heat. Inside, ambition had no place. My father, Harold, came home from the steel mill each night with grease embedded in the lines of his hands, his shoulders slumped, and his jaw set in a permanent scowl. My mother, Lillian, worked part-time at a diner but spent most of her energy maintaining the strict order my father demanded. In that house, education wasn't a goal, it was an inconvenience. My father called it a waste of time for people who can't work with their hands. My mother rarely offered an opinion of her own. She repeated his words until they felt like a chorus I couldn't turn off. From my earliest years, I learned that my achievements meant little at home. A perfect score on a math test earned nothing more than a shrug. A science fair ribbon was dismissed with a comment about how cute it was but how useless it would be in real life. My older brother, Ryan, was their pride. At 17, he dropped out of school to work alongside my father at the mill. "That's a real success story," my father would say. Ryan had done what they valued, followed orders, made money, and stayed put. By the time I reached high school, I had stopped sharing my accomplishments with them entirely. I found safety in the school library, in teachers who saw potential my parents refused to acknowledge. Mrs. Grayson, my English teacher, was the first to tell me directly that college could be my way out. I held on to those words like a lifeline, but in Millbrook, saying you wanted to leave was almost a betrayal. I learned to keep my ambitions quiet, applying for colleges and scholarships in secret. The school's computers became my window to a different life. I created an email account my parents didn't know about and filed every acceptance letter away in a folder only I could access. When the envelope from State University arrived, my hands trembled as I held it. I had been offered a full scholarship, the kind of opportunity people said didn't come to girls from towns like mine. For a few moments, I allowed myself to believe this was the turning point. I never imagined my mother would take it from me before I could even tell anyone. She claimed she had gotten the mail that day, by accident, and had opened the envelope herself. When I walked into the kitchen, she was already standing there with the letter unfolded in her hands. Her expression wasn't surprise. It was something closer to contempt. Without a word, she reached for the matches she kept by the stove. I remember the sound more than anything, the faint scrape as the match ignited, the swift whoosh as the flame caught the edge of the paper. For a split second, the words blurred in the heat, the crest at the top glowing orange before collapsing into black ash. When she spoke, her voice was low but sharp enough to cut. "You'll just fail like always. Why waste everyone's time?" I didn't move. My feet felt anchored to the tile floor, my throat tight. All I could think was that she had burned not just a piece of paper, but the proof of everything I'd fought for since I was a child. To her, It was nothing. She shook the ashes into the sink, ran the tap until the water swept them down the drain, and went back to her day as if she hadn't just erased my future. That night, lying awake in my old twin bed, I stared at the ceiling and realized something I had been avoiding for years. My parents weren't simply unsupportive. They were actively rooting against me. Every step forward I tried to take, they would find a way to pull me back. But that night was also the beginning of something else. The ember of anger that had been smoldering for years finally caught. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew this. They weren't going to win. Millbrook was the kind of place where change felt impossible. Generations worked the same jobs, lived in the same houses, and passed down the same grudges. The streets were lined with the remains of what had once been thriving shops, now just boarded windows and fading signs. People didn't dream here. They survived. I was born into a family that saw survival as the only goal worth having. My father believed in hard work the way some people believed in religion: unshakable, unquestionable, and not to be discussed. He woke before sunrise every day, his alarm slicing through the dark like a drill. By the time I was dressed for school, he had already put in an hour of labor in the garage, fixing whatever old equipment the neighbors brought over. My mother matched his rhythm, not out of devotion, but out of habit. She kept the house running exactly as he liked it: spotless floors, clothes folded with sharp edges, meals served on time. She didn't see herself as someone with dreams anymore, if she ever had them at all. Instead, she measured her worth in how smoothly my father's days went. From the beginning, I learned to make myself small in that house. My earliest memories aren't of bedtime stories or encouragement, but of silence, the kind that could shift from harmless to heavy in an instant. If my father came home in a foul mood, we all felt it. My mother would keep her voice low, my brother Ryan would disappear into his room, and I would retreat into whatever book I could find. Books became my first escape. The library at school was small, but to me it felt like a doorway to somewhere else. I read about cities with skyscrapers and streets full of people who didn't all know each other's names. I read about scientists and writers and leaders who started with nothing but ideas. I started to believe in the quiet corners of my mind that I might be able to leave this place someday. But at home, my curiosity was something to be managed, not encouraged. If I asked too many questions at the dinner table, my father would frown and tell me to stop acting smarter than everyone else. My mother would change the subject quickly, as if to keep the peace. I learned to hold my thoughts in until I was back at school, where teachers like Mrs. Grayson or Mr. Alvarez seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. School was the only place where I felt seen. I excelled in every subject, partly because I enjoyed learning, and partly because it was the only way I could prove to myself that I was worth something. When I was in 3rd grade, I won the district spelling bee. My parents didn't attend. My mother said she had errands to run, and my father was working overtime. That evening, I came home with a medal around my neck, and my father barely looked up from the television. By middle school, I had stopped expecting applause. Instead, I focused on collecting quiet victories: perfect report cards, awards that I hid in a drawer, essays returned with high marks. My teachers noticed. Some of them encouraged me to think about college, planting seeds I didn't dare water too openly at home. High school brought new challenges. Ryan had already dropped out by then, following my father into the mill. This made him a hero in their eyes, the kind of child who understood what life was really about. I became the opposite, the one wasting her time on books and nonsense. Every time I brought home an honor roll certificate, my father would shake his head and say, "That won't keep the lights on." I started working part-time at the library after school. It wasn't just a job, it was a refuge. Surrounded by shelves of stories, I could imagine a life that wasn't measured by paychecks and exhaustion. The librarian, Mrs. Patel, became an unexpected mentor. She showed me how to research scholarship opportunities and even let me use the staff computer to fill out applications. She never asked too many questions about why I had to keep it secret. Keeping it secret became second nature. I created a separate email account that my parents didn't know about, storing every piece of correspondence from universities in a hidden folder. The more I planned, the more I realized that leaving wouldn't just be about opportunity. It would be about survival. But the secrecy came at a cost. It meant I was living a double life: the obedient daughter who kept her head down at home, and the ambitious student who stayed late after school, hungry for any chance to escape. It was exhausting, but the alternative, letting them know my plans, felt like handing them a weapon they'd use against me. There were close calls. Once, my father came into my room while I was filling out a scholarship essay. I slammed my notebook shut so quickly that I bent the cover. He looked at me suspiciously, but I told him I was working on homework. The tension in that moment was enough to make me keep my applications at the library from then on. I never told Ryan anything. He had long since absorbed my parents' beliefs about me, that I was a dreamer, a soft person who would never survive in the real world. In his eyes, the only thing worse than failing was trying in the first place. By my final year of high school, I had applied to half a dozen universities. State University was my first choice. I had studied their programs, memorized the names of professors, even printed pictures of the campus, and kept them in a folder under my bed. I didn't know if I would get in, but the thought of being accepted kept me going through the long months of waiting. That folder under my bed became my most valuable possession. Inside it were the pieces of a life I hadn't yet lived, essays I was proud of, application confirmations, letters of recommendation from teachers who believed in me. If my parents ever found it, I knew it would all be over. The day the acceptance letter arrived, I thought about that folder as I walked home from school. I imagined adding this letter to it, the final piece of proof that I could leave. But when I stepped into the kitchen and saw my mother standing there with the envelope already opened in her hands, my stomach sank. What happened next? The match, the fire, her words, would burn far deeper than the paper ever could. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew, in that moment before the flames, was that my secret life had been exposed. And in this house, exposed dreams were always the first to be destroyed. The smell of burnt paper lingered for days. It clung to the curtains, to the fabric of my clothes, to the inside of my nose. Every time I caught a whiff of it, my stomach tightened. I tried opening windows to let the air clear, but it felt like the house itself refused to let it go. For the first 24 hours after my mother burned my college acceptance letter, I moved through the house like a ghost. I kept to my room, afraid of crossing paths with either of my parents. I thought about the letter constantly, not just what it said, but what it represented. It had been more than an invitation to study. It was the first concrete evidence that I could actually leave this place. Now it was ash in the kitchen sink. My mother carried on as though nothing had happened. She hummed while she folded laundry, chatted with my father over dinner, and even asked me to help her make a grocery list, as if we hadn't stood in that same kitchen while she destroyed the thing I'd worked for years to achieve. I didn't bring it up. I didn't ask why she'd done it. I knew the answer already. You'll just fail like always. Those words had been her refrain for as long as I could remember. If I tried to bake something new, she'd remind me how I'd once burned a cake. If I attempted a difficult assignment, she'd point out the time I'd struggled with another. To her, the past was a fixed map of my capabilities, and every misstep was a permanent landmark. She believed people didn't change, especially me. The letter had threatened that belief. My success would have proven her wrong, and so it had to go. 2 days later, I went to the library after school. The librarian, Mrs. Patel, looked at me the way people do when they know something is wrong but aren't sure how to ask. I sat at the computer in the far corner, logged into my secret email, and pulled up the message from State University. I had deleted nothing, not the acceptance email, not the congratulatory message from the scholarship committee. The physical letter was gone, but the proof still existed. I printed out the acceptance email and tucked it into a folder I kept in my backpack. It wasn't as satisfying as holding the real letter, but it was something. And in that moment, I realized my plan wasn't over. My mother had destroyed paper, not possibility. The next problem was money. My scholarship covered tuition, but there were still living expenses to consider: housing, food, transportation. I'd been saving from my library job, but it wasn't enough. The extra shifts I could take wouldn't close the gap. That week, I started applying for part-time jobs in town, careful to choose places my parents wouldn't notice. A small cafe on the far side of Millbrook hired me for weekend mornings. It was grueling, but it gave me cash I could stash away in a shoebox under my bed. I didn't tell anyone, not even Ryan, especially not Ryan. My brother had been distant ever since the letter-burning incident. He hadn't said anything about it to me directly, but I overheard him talking to my father one night. "She thinks she's better than us," he said. "Let her try it. She'll come crawling back." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him I didn't think I was better. I just wanted something different. But in our family, wanting different was the same as thinking you were better. It was the ultimate betrayal. School became my only safe space. I threw myself into my final assignments, determined to graduate with the highest GPA I could manage. My teachers noticed the extra effort, but none of them knew the full story. I wasn't ready to tell them. Admitting that my own mother had sabotaged me felt too raw, too humiliating. Still, I found small moments of quiet rebellion. I ordered the cheapest prepaid cell phone I could find online, shipping it to the library so it wouldn't arrive at the house. I used it only for college-related calls and messages. It was my lifeline to the world beyond Millbrook. Every time I walked past the mailbox, I imagined the acceptance letter arriving again, untouched, and me tucking it safely into my backpack. That fantasy kept me going on the days when I wondered if I was just fooling myself. The summer before I was supposed to start at State University was the longest of my life. My parents believed I was planning to stay in Millbrook and figure things out after graduation. I let them believe it. I smiled at dinner, nodded when they spoke, and went to bed early so I could lie in the dark and make mental lists of what I would need to pack. There were moments when I almost told someone the truth, Mrs. Patel or Mrs. Grayson, or even my best friend from school. But every time I got close, I stopped myself. The fewer people who knew, the smaller the chance my parents would find out before I was ready. By August, I had enough saved to cover my first few months of living expenses. It wasn't much, but it would buy me time to find work near campus. The night before I planned to leave, I packed my backpack with the essentials: a few changes of clothes, my printed acceptance email, the prepaid phone, and the shoebox of cash. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, listening to the creaks of the house I had grown up in, the pipes shifting, the wind against the windows, the faint hum of the refrigerator. For all its flaws, it had been my home. Leaving it felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff, but staying felt worse. When the first light of morning came, I slipped out of bed, dressed quietly, and left without a goodbye. My parents didn't hear me, or maybe they did and just didn't care. At the bus station, I sat with my backpack on my lap and my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. The ticket in my hand was one way. I didn't know exactly what waited for me at the other end, but I knew this: whatever it was mine. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. The bus ride to State University was 4 hours, but it felt like crossing an ocean. I watched the familiar landscape fade through the window: the gray rooftops, the rusted factory signs, the same gas stations that had stood for decades. Each mile put more distance between me and the life I was leaving behind. When the city skyline appeared in the distance, my chest tightened. I had seen pictures of the university in brochures, but the reality was bigger, brighter, and louder. The streets were alive with people walking quickly, carrying books and laptops, speaking in accents I didn't recognize. It was as if the whole world had been condensed into a single place. The campus stretched for blocks, with wide green lawns, tall trees, and buildings that looked like they had been standing for 100 years. My hands shook slightly as I stepped off the bus, my backpack heavier than its contents should have made it. This was the place I had fought for, the place my mother had tried to erase with a single flame. I found my way to the housing office, where I was assigned a small dorm room in an older brick building. The space was modest, a bed, a desk, a narrow closet, but to me, it was a kingdom. No one would tell me to turn off the light if I wanted to read. No one would demand to know why I was studying instead of doing something useful. For the first time, the space I occupied belonged only to me. The first few weeks were overwhelming. I had been prepared for the academic work, but not for the constant stream of choices and responsibilities. Managing my class schedule, finding my way around campus, and figuring out how to feed myself on a tight budget all felt like tests I hadn't studied for. I learned quickly that everything cost more than I had planned, and that even with my scholarship, I would need more income to survive. I took a job in the campus library, shelving books and managing the circulation desk during late shifts. The work was familiar and comforting, a small island of routine in a sea of new experiences. Still, the pay was minimal, and I soon added a second job at a coffee shop near campus. My days began before sunrise and ended well after midnight, my energy stretched thin between work and study. Classes were demanding in ways I hadn't experienced before. Back in Millbrook, I had often been the top of my class without much effort, but here everyone was sharp, ambitious, and unafraid to speak up. At first, I kept to myself, hesitant to raise my hand or voice my ideas. I worried that I didn't belong, that I had somehow slipped into this place by mistake. But slowly, something shifted. The more I listened, the more I realized that I could keep up. Not just with the material, but with the conversations, the debates, the pace of the lectures. My professors encouraged critical thinking, pushing us to question assumptions and defend our positions with evidence. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. Even so, the shadow of home followed me. I thought often about my parents, about Ryan, about the life I had left behind. I didn't call them, and they didn't call me. There was no celebration of my acceptance, no curiosity about how I was doing. The silence between us felt like both a relief and a wound. On difficult nights, when the exhaustion blurred my vision and the numbers in my bank account made my stomach knot, I wondered if they were right. Maybe I was chasing something I couldn't hold on to. Maybe failure was inevitable. But then I would walk through campus the next morning, past the library's tall windows and the smell of fresh coffee from the student center, and remember that I had already done the hardest part. I had left. I had stepped into a world they had told me was not mine, and I was still standing in it. The first semester passed in a blur of exams, work shifts, and endless cups of coffee. My grades were solid, though not perfect, and I told myself that was enough. I had survived the transition, learned the rhythms of this new life, and begun to believe, just a little, that I belonged here. Winter break came, and I stayed on campus to avoid returning to Millbrook. The dorms were quiet, the air sharp with cold, and the snow turned the campus into something out of the books I had read as a child. I worked extra shifts at the library, saving what I could for the next semester. It was during those quiet weeks that I realized something important. Survival was no longer enough. I hadn't fought my way here just to scrape by. I wanted to thrive. I wanted to graduate not just with a degree, but with the confidence that I had earned my place. That thought carried me into the spring semester with a new determination. I began speaking up more in class, meeting with professors during office hours, and forming study groups with classmates. I still worked long hours, but I managed my time more carefully, carving out space for rest when I could. Life wasn't easy, but it was mine. And for the first time, I could see the outlines of the future I had imagined back when I was hiding acceptance letters under the floorboards of my bedroom. It was still far away, but it was real, and I was moving toward it step by step. The second year of college began with the same tight budget, the same long hours at work, and the same determination that had carried me through the first. But something else had settled in, too, a quiet confidence I hadn't felt before. I was no longer the girl who had arrived with shaking hands and a backpack full of secrets. I had proven to myself that I could survive here, and now I wanted to see how far I could go. I enrolled in more challenging courses, pushing myself beyond the requirements for my major. It meant heavier reading loads and more time in the library, but I found I thrived under the pressure. The more I learned, the more I wanted to know. Professors began to recognize my name and occasionally my work. When I handed in a research paper, I no longer feared it would come back covered in red ink. Instead, I hoped for notes that would push me further. At the library job, I became someone the staff relied on. I took on additional responsibilities, helping students with research, managing special collections, organizing events. The extra hours were welcome for the paycheck, but they also made me feel rooted here in a way I had never felt in Millbrook. The library had always been my safe place, and now it was also my workplace. My second job at the coffee shop was less fulfilling but necessary. Early mornings there were relentless, the line of customers never ending, the orders blurring together. But in those hours before class, I learned the art of endurance, how to keep going when my feet ached, when my hands were raw from washing dishes, when my eyes burned from lack of sleep. It was training for the kind of resilience I didn't know I would soon need again. Because in the middle of that year, the silence from my family broke. It came in the form of a short, impersonal letter from my mother. There was no acknowledgement of where I was or what I was doing, only a request for me to send money to help cover a household bill. It was as if she had skipped over every part of my life that didn't fit her narrative and gone straight to what she felt I owed. I stared at the letter for a long time before tucking it into a drawer. I didn't respond. I couldn't. It wasn't about the money. It was about the sudden reminder of how they saw me, not as a daughter with her own life, but as a resource they could tap when convenient. For weeks afterward, I found it harder to focus. Old thoughts crept in, whispering that maybe they were right, maybe I was selfish for leaving, maybe I was chasing something I didn't deserve. It took deliberate effort to push those thoughts aside and remind myself of the truth. I had built this life for myself. I didn't owe anyone an apology for that. By my third year, I began to think about what would come next. Graduate school was a possibility I had never let myself consider before, but the idea took root after one of my professors suggested it. The thought of pursuing advanced research thrilled me, but it also scared me. Graduate programs were competitive, expensive, and often far from home. Not that home had much pull anymore. Still, I began preparing. I attended lectures outside my required courses, took on an unpaid research assistant position, and started saving every spare dollar. My life became a careful balance of ambition and survival. Just enough work to keep me afloat, just enough rest to keep me functional, and every other moment poured into my studies. Socially, I kept my circle small. I made a few close friends, people who didn't press for details about my family but supported me in other ways. They celebrated my wins, reminded me to eat when I was buried in work, and never questioned why I spent my breaks on campus instead of visiting home. I never told them about the acceptance letter or the fire, but I think they sensed there was a story I wasn't ready to share. The summers were the hardest. Most students went home or traveled, but I stayed on campus, taking extra classes and working full-time hours. The emptiness of the campus made me feel both free and lonely. I would walk across the wide lawns in the evening, the air heavy with the scent of cut grass, and wonder if I was missing something essential about youth by spending mine in constant work. But then I would remember what the alternative was. Evenings in Millbrook with the sound of the factory whistle in the distance, the same narrow walls, the same dismissive voices. And I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. By my final undergraduate year, I had built a resume strong enough to apply to graduate programs. I kept that process as secret as I had kept my first college applications. Even though my parents had no presence in my daily life, I couldn't shake the fear that they might somehow interfere again. The memory of the burning letter was still sharp, a reminder of how quickly they could try to erase my future. I submitted my applications late one night from the quiet corner of the library. When the confirmations came through, I saved them in multiple places: my personal email, a USB drive, a printed copy in my desk drawer. I refused to give fate a single point of failure. Graduation came in the spring. I walked across the stage in a borrowed gown, my name called out to a sea of strangers. There was no one in the audience for me, but I didn't feel as hollow as I had feared. This moment was mine alone, the product of every hidden plan, every late night, every hour spent working toward something they had told me I couldn't have. After the ceremony, I returned to my dorm, hung the tassel from my mirror, and sat in silence. I wasn't celebrating with family, but I was celebrating with myself. And that was enough. The next chapter of my life was waiting, and I was ready to step into it. But I didn't know yet that before I could, I would be pulled back into the orbit of the people who had once tried to burn my dreams to the ground. The summer after graduation should have been a season of relief. I had earned my degree, my resume was strong, and I had graduate school applications in progress. But beneath that, there was a current of unease I couldn't ignore. My savings were thin, and the cost of living in the city had climbed faster than I could keep up. The rent for my small shared apartment was due to increase, and my second job had cut back my hours. I told myself it was temporary, that I could pick up freelance work or find a third job until graduate school began. But the weeks slipped by, and the numbers in my bank account kept shrinking. I applied for dozens of positions, sat through interviews that led nowhere, and stretched every dollar until it felt brittle. By mid-July, the reality was unavoidable. I couldn't afford to stay where I was. The thought of returning to Millbrook made my chest tighten, but I couldn't see another option. It would only be for a few months, I told myself, just long enough to save for the move to graduate school. When I stepped off the bus in Millbrook, it felt like I had stepped backward in time. The air was heavy with the smell of the factory, the streets unchanged, the same tired faces moving through the same routines. My parents' house looked exactly as I remembered: peeling paint, sagging porch, curtains drawn against the summer light. Inside, nothing had shifted. The furniture sat in the same places, the walls held the same faded photos, and the air carried the same unspoken rules. My father was older, his shoulders more stooped, but his voice still carried the same edge. My mother moved through the house with the same brisk efficiency, her expression unreadable. I kept to my room as much as possible. I set up my laptop on the small desk, stacking my graduate school application materials in neat piles. I told myself this was temporary, that I was just passing through. But the house had a way of shrinking my world, of making the future feel distant and fragile. Work came quickly enough. I took a job at the local grocery store, stocking shelves overnight. The pay was low and the hours rough, but it kept me out of the house during the times when my parents were most alert and likely to ask questions. During the day, I worked on application essays and research proposals, determined not to lose momentum. Still, the tension in the house was constant. My presence seemed to unsettle them, as if my being there reminded them of a story they didn't want to acknowledge, the one where I had left and succeeded on my own terms. My mother, especially, seemed restless around me. I caught her glancing at my desk at the stack of neatly organized papers, as if trying to read them from a distance. I became more cautious, hiding my documents in a locked suitcase when I wasn't using them. I backed up every file twice, once on a USB drive I carried in my pocket, and once on a cloud account she didn't know existed. The memory of the acceptance letter's ashes was still vivid. I refused to give her another opportunity. But there was another layer to the unease. Being back in Millbrook meant running into people I hadn't seen in years. Some offered polite congratulations on my degree, but others looked at me with thinly veiled skepticism, as if waiting for proof that I had wasted my time. Gossip moved quickly here, and I knew that my parents had their own version of my story, one where my successes were minimized, my struggles magnified. I tried to let it slide off me, but it wore on me more than I wanted to admit. The days felt heavier, the nights shorter, my energy sapped by the constant effort of holding on to my plans in a place where they felt impossible. September arrived, and with it, the first email notification. A graduate program was interested in my application and wanted to set up an interview. I sat at my desk, heart pounding, rereading the message. This was it. The door was opening. I scheduled the interview, taking care to do it during my overnight work break, alone in the grocery store's small back office. It went better than I could have hoped. A week later, the official acceptance arrived in my inbox, followed by a physical letter mailed to my address in Millbrook. The moment I saw the university's crest on the envelope, my hands began to shake. I knew I should have asked them to send it to a friend's address or to the store, but I hadn't thought it through. I brought it upstairs to my room and opened it carefully, reading the words I had been waiting for. Full acceptance. Funding included. I tucked the letter back into its envelope and slid it into my locked suitcase. My plan was simple: keep it hidden until I could leave. But living under the same roof with my mother meant every step required precision. She had a way of appearing when I least expected it, moving silently down the hallway, glancing at my desk. I began to feel the same tension I had lived with in high school, the constant awareness that my ambitions were something dangerous to show. Every day, I woke with the uneasy sense that the walls were closing in. The difference was that now, I had a ticket out. But I also knew that ticket was made of paper, and paper could burn. As autumn deepened, I worked more hours, saving every cent for the move. The acceptance letter stayed hidden, but the fear of losing it never left me. I remembered too well the sound of the match, the rush of flame, the finality of watching my future turn to ash. And even though I told myself I was being paranoid, there was a part of me that knew history had a way of repeating itself in this house. The days leading up to the incident felt strange, as if the air in the house had thickened. My mother moved through the rooms with an energy I couldn't quite place. Not anger exactly, but something sharp beneath the surface, like a current waiting to snap. My father seemed quieter than usual, though he still carried the same disapproval in his eyes every time he glanced in my direction. By then, I had been back in Millbrook for several months. The return had stripped away much of the progress I thought I had made in building my confidence. The house had its own gravity, pulling me back into old patterns, keeping my head down, minimizing my presence, measuring my words. It was the same invisible choreography I had learned as a teenager, a survival dance in which you never drew too much attention to yourself. But I couldn't be invisible forever. The letter in my suitcase was a reminder of that. Every time I thought about it, my chest tightened, not with fear of the opportunity, but with fear of losing it before I could act. I had learned the hard way that in this house, a piece of paper could be as fragile as a dream. My plan was simple. In 3 weeks, I would leave. My acceptance to the graduate program included a stipend, enough to cover a modest apartment near campus. I had saved enough for the move and the first month's expenses. I had arranged for a friend to meet me at the bus station. All that was left was to wait and keep my head low. But waiting in this house was never simple. The walls carried every sound, and privacy was a concept that didn't exist. My mother had a way of appearing without warning, stepping into my room under the pretense of dropping off laundry or checking in. I kept my suitcase locked at all times, but the more often she lingered near it, the more I felt the familiar heat of paranoia building inside me. The acceptance letter itself had become almost talismanic. I would take it out at night when the house was silent, unfolding it slowly, running my fingers over the embossed crest at the top. Reading the words again gave me a small spark of hope that I clung to when the days felt heavy. But it also reminded me how much I had to lose. Outside of the house, my world had shrunk to the grocery store where I stocked shelves and the bus ride to and from work. The store was a dull kind of sanctuary, repetitive, unremarkable, but free of the constant undercurrent of hostility. There, my tasks were clear and my efforts were measured in pallets unloaded and aisles organized. No one tried to sabotage my progress. No one questioned why I was there. Back at home, every interaction felt loaded. My mother's questions about my work, my plans, my time were never casual. They were probes, meant to extract something, to test for weaknesses in my walls. I gave her nothing but the bare minimum of information, but even silence could be suspicious in this house. One afternoon, I came home from a long shift to find my bedroom door slightly ajar. The lock on my suitcase was untouched, but the desk drawers were misaligned, and the papers I kept on top of the desk were no longer stacked as I had left them. The sensation that someone had been sifting through my things was unmistakable. I told myself it could have been my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed listening to the creaks of the house, the groan of floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional shift of pipes. Every sound felt amplified. I thought about moving the letter to a safer place, maybe to my locker at work, but the risk of carrying it back and forth seemed even greater. The next morning, my mother was unusually quiet. She avoided eye contact, moving around the kitchen with a deliberate calm that made my skin prickle. My instincts told me something was coming, but I didn't know when or how. The following days blurred together in a haze of vigilance. I found myself checking the suitcase lock more often, counting the days until my departure like a prisoner marking lines on a wall. My shifts at the store became my only relief, but even there, my mind wandered back to the house and the fragile envelope hidden inside it. Then came the evening when everything tipped. I returned from work to find the living room unusually tidy, the air smelling faintly of furniture polish. My father was watching television, but my mother wasn't in sight. I felt the familiar weight in my stomach as I walked down the hall toward my room. The door was closed. That alone was unusual. I never left it that way. When I stepped inside, the suitcase was still there, the lock still in place. But the desk drawers were open, and the small tin box where I kept spare keys and receipts sat empty on top of the desk. The acceptance letter wasn't in the suitcase anymore. My breath caught in my throat. The space where it should have been felt like a hole in the floor. I searched frantically, but it was gone. The room was too quiet, the house too still. I knew then that this wasn't about misplacement. The familiar, suffocating knowledge settled over me. History was about to repeat itself. I walked back into the hallway, and the faint scent of smoke reached me before I saw anything. It wasn't strong, just a ghost of a smell, but enough to send my pulse into overdrive. I had lived this moment before, and I knew exactly how it ended. The scent of smoke was faint but unmistakable, the kind that clings to the air long after the match has gone out. I moved toward the kitchen without meaning to, my feet carrying me on instinct. The hallway felt longer than it should have, the air heavier with each step. When I turned the corner, I saw her. My mother stood by the stove, the overhead light casting sharp shadows across her face. In her hands was the letter. My letter, its cream-colored paper now marred by the first licks of flame. Time seemed to slow, each movement exaggerated. The matchbox sat open on the counter, the flame from the gas burner steady and bright. Her hands were steady too, holding the paper just above the blue ring of fire. I froze. The room was so quiet that I could hear the faint crackle as the flame caught the edge of the envelope. The embossed crest at the top of the letter began to curl, the gold ink warping into blackened lines. She didn't look at me, didn't speak. It was as if I wasn't even there. The flame spread quickly, eating its way down the page, the words blurring into unreadable shapes. Ash flaked away and fell into the burner's steady heat. A rush of heat and memory collided. The first letter, years ago. The one she had taken from me before I even had the chance to celebrate. That day had been filled with shock, with disbelief. This time, there was no disbelief. Only the crushing weight of knowing I had been right to be afraid all along. I wanted to move forward, to snatch the letter from her hands, but I didn't. Something in me recognized the futility of it. The paper was already more ash than substance, the words already lost to smoke. The fire had won before I'd even entered the room. She held it until the flames reached her fingers, then let the last charred corner drop into a metal pan beside the stove. It landed silently among the black scraps that had once been whole sentences, whole futures. The smell filled the kitchen, sharp, acrid, final. My throat tightened, my chest ached, and yet I stood rooted to the floor. It was as though the house itself demanded my stillness, the way it had so many times before. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about the letter. It was about erasing proof. Proof that I had left once and could leave again. Proof that I was capable of building a life beyond the narrow borders of this house. Proof that she could be wrong about me. Without the letter, she could pretend none of it had ever happened. She could tell herself, and anyone who asked, that I had never been accepted, that the idea of me going to graduate school had been nothing more than a fantasy I'd made up. I could feel the narrative closing in, the one she had always preferred. The daughter who stayed, who failed, who never became more than she was in this small, stifling town. But something inside me shifted as I watched the last pieces of paper dissolve into ash. I wasn't the same person I had been the first time this happened. Back then, I had let the loss define me for weeks, had carried the weight of it like a stone in my chest. Now, I felt the loss differently. Sharp, yes, but not defining. The truth was still mine, even if the paper was gone. The acceptance still existed in emails, in conversations with faculty, in the digital records that no match could touch. She had taken the physical token, but she hadn't destroyed the reality behind it. Still, the act itself left a mark. Watching someone destroy something you've worked for, something that represents years of effort and sacrifice, is like watching them try to set fire to you. It's an erasure, a rewriting of what's possible. And it's done with the same casual cruelty as tossing a scrap of trash into the bin. When it was over, she left the pan on the counter, the ashes cooling into brittle fragments. I stood there for a long time after she walked away, staring at what was left. The silence in the kitchen was suffocating, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly loud in the absence of her presence. I wanted to sweep the ashes into my hands, to keep them as a reminder of what had happened. But I knew that holding on to them would do nothing but poison me. So I left them where they were. Let her think she had erased it all. That night, I sat on my bed with my laptop balanced across my knees. I pulled up the email from the graduate program, the same words that had been on the paper now reduced to soot. I read them again, slowly, letting each one sink in. I forwarded the email to a trusted friend, then to my own secondary account, then saved a copy to my USB drive. This time, I wasn't going to be caught unprepared. The destruction of the letter was not going to change my departure date. If anything, it cemented it. The fire she had set was her attempt to chain me here, but instead it had become the final push I needed to leave without looking back. In 3 days, I would be gone. The house was quiet as I lay down, but I knew I wouldn't sleep. The smell of smoke clung to my hair, to my clothes, to the air itself. I closed my eyes and thought of the campus waiting for me, the apartment where I would unpack without fear, the life that would be entirely my own. The fire had taken a letter. It hadn't taken me. 3 days after the fire, I woke before dawn. The house was still and dark, the air heavy with the stale scent of smoke that never seemed to fully leave. I moved quietly, packing the last of my belongings into the locked suitcase and the worn backpack I had carried through my undergraduate years. Every item I placed inside felt like an act of reclaiming. My laptop, my notes, my USB drive holding the acceptance letter she couldn't touch. I didn't say goodbye. Words like that didn't exist in this house, not for me. I slipped out the front door with my keys in one pocket and my bus ticket in the other. The morning air was cool, the sky still holding the pale light of early dawn. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest began to lift. At the bus station, I sat in the hard plastic chair and stared out the window at the town I had spent so much of my life trying to escape. The streets were empty, the storefronts still shuttered, the same layers of dust clinging to everything. Millbrook was frozen in time, but I wasn't. I was leaving, and this time, I wasn't coming back. The bus pulled away, and the view shifted, the faded houses giving way to open stretches of road, the horizon widening with every mile. I watched the town shrink into the distance until it was nothing more than a smudge in the rearview mirror of my mind. When the city skyline came into view hours later, it felt like crossing an invisible line. I stepped off the bus into a rush of movement, people speaking in different languages, traffic lights blinking, the smell of coffee and rain on warm pavement. It was loud, chaotic, and alive. I let myself breathe it in. The apartment I had rented was small, barely more than a single room with a kitchenette, but it was mine. I set my suitcase on the floor, opened the window to let in fresh air, and stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the city. No one here would tell me to dim my light, to stop trying, to accept less than I was capable of. The first weeks of the doctoral program were intense. The workload was heavier than anything I had experienced before. Long hours of research, dense readings, discussions that demanded precision and depth. But I felt alive in that challenge. Each assignment, each lecture, each moment in the library reminded me why I had fought so hard to get here. The memory of the fire still lingered. Sometimes, in the middle of a seminar or late at night while writing, I would think of the way the letter curled in the flames, the smell of burning paper, the silence afterward. But instead of letting it hollow me out, I began to use it. It became fuel. Every achievement, every step forward was another thing they couldn't take from me. I built a small but steady routine, mornings in class, afternoons in the research lab, evenings working part-time at the university library. On weekends, I explored the city, learning its streets, finding small cafes where I could write without interruption. It was a life that left little room for the past, but the past had a way of following me in fragments. Occasionally, I would see an email from someone in Millbrook, a classmate, a distant relative, asking if I ever planned to visit. I ignored most of them. I wasn't ready, and maybe I never would be. The thought of stepping back into that house, of breathing in that air heavy with unspoken rules, felt like suffocation. Instead, I poured myself into the work. The deeper I went into my research, the more I felt a sense of ownership over my future. I wasn't just chasing a degree, I was building something permanent, something no match could turn to ash. Months passed, and I realized I was no longer counting the distance from Millbrook in miles, but in days, in achievements, in the growing space between who I had been and who I was becoming. I was no longer the girl clutching a letter in secret, afraid of it being stolen. I was the woman shaping her own life, with or without anyone's approval. And for the first time, I didn't just feel free. I felt untouchable. Years later, I can still see the flames. Not because they haunt me, but because they remind me of everything I built in spite of them. The memory isn't about the fire anymore. It's about what survived it. My doctoral program became more than an academic pursuit. It became a reclamation. Each year, I advanced not just in research but in the understanding that my worth had never been defined by the people who tried to erase it. I published my first paper in a respected journal, presented at conferences in cities I'd once only read about, and mentored students who reminded me of myself at 18, ambitious, scared, and unsure if they were allowed to want more. In those conversations, I never told them the full story of Millbrook, but I told them enough. I told them that sometimes the hardest part of chasing your dream isn't the work itself, but holding on to it when people closest to you try to tear it away. I told them that leaving isn't betrayal. Sometimes it's the only way to save yourself. By the time I defended my dissertation, the distance between me and my old life felt immeasurable. Millbrook was still there, unchanged, but it no longer had a claim on me. The house where my letters burned was just another address in a place I no longer belonged. The diploma I received that day wasn't just paper. It was proof. Proof that the future my mother told me I'd never have was mine because I refused to let her write my ending. Proof that even in the absence of support, it is possible to stand up, move forward, and build something lasting. When I walked out of the graduation hall into the sunlight, I didn't think about the people who weren't there to see it. I thought about the version of me who once hid letters under her bed, who stayed late at the library filling out applications in secret. I thought about the girl who left home with a backpack and a one-way bus ticket. She had no guarantee that she would make it, but she left anyway. I still carry her with me. Today, my life is full in ways I couldn't have imagined back then. I have a home filled with books and light, friends who have become family, and work that challenges and inspires me. The shadows of the past are still there, but they no longer dictate my path. Sometimes, when I catch the faint scent of smoke, from a fireplace, from a candle, I think of those letters. But I don't feel anger anymore. I feel a quiet kind of pride. Because those flames were meant to keep me small, and instead, they became the fire I used to forge my future. If you are watching this and you've been told you can't, that you'll fail, that your dreams are too big, I want you to know this. Their words are not the truth. You are allowed to want more. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to build a life that looks nothing like the one they planned for you. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you've faced your own version of the fire, I would love to hear your story in the comments. Your voice matters, your future matters, and no one, no matter how close they are, has the right to burn it down.